over 2,000 arrests in 3 months. The whole of last year, there were 248 arrests under the Terrorism Act. So where is it, all these resources being spent on people holding placards, people holding up magazines, people wearing T-shirts, just in the service of what? To protect the Israeli weapons industry, to protect their relationship with Israel. The very existence of these factories meant that the destruction of Palestine would continue because their whole business model was based on the destruction and colonization of Palestine in order to make and develop these weapons and surveillance technology upon them and then sell them to other governments across the world. They can prescribe Palestine action, they cannot stop direct action happening against these weapons manufacturers.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I'm your host, Ammar Kazmi, and in this show, we delve into the forces of war, imperialism, and Zionism, exploring their impact on our world and what it will take to overcome them. Today, it is a singular honor for me to be joined by Huda Ammori. Huda is a pioneering Palestinian-Iraqi political leader, organizer, and campaigner, best known for co-founding the direct action network Palestine Action in 2020, dedicated to disrupting the Zionist war machine in Britain, mainly by targeting Israel's largest weapons manufacturer, Elbit Systems. But earlier this year, the British government prescribed Palestine Action as a so-called terrorist organization, something which Huda is challenging in court. Indeed, Huda continues to campaign and to make sacrifices in support of Palestinian liberation, and it's my pleasure to welcome her to the show today. So, Huda, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's just start by looking at the whole purpose of taking direct action. So, what's the whole point of taking action against arms factories rather than protesting and engaging with politicians and so on?
So the late David Graeber had a quote about direct action, and he said, "Protest is like begging the powers that be to dig a well, and direct action is digging the well yourself and daring them to stop you." And that's in essence is what it's about. It's rather than appealing to the oppressors, it's going straight to the source and intervening to create that change yourselves, rather than going through a middle person such as the government or an institution you're appealing to create change. So, in the context of Palestine, uh, Palestine Action started in 2020, and we had regular protests, regular marches, campaigns, but they all revolved around, or mainly revolved around, appealing to the government to create their policies. And a lot of it is based on trying to reason with them with the facts and the information because we know we have truth on our side. It's actually really basic what we're asking for, respect of international law, etc. And you point out what these companies do, and yet they just continue to work with them, they continue to make contracts with them. So appealing to them and using reason wasn't working. And a lot of that is because these institutions are captured to a certain extent, are very pro-Israel. I mean, when you're operating in Britain, you have to remember the history that this is a country that was involved in the colonization of Palestine for over 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, and every single successive government has maintained that policy of supporting the colonization. So rather than doing that, or asking the government to shut Albert down, which they had failed to do, in fact, they had enabled Albert Systems, Israel's biggest weapons company. Direct action was about going straight to the Elbit factories, straight to where the weapons were made, and to shut them down using our own bodies and to dismantle them and damage them in order to stop them from functioning for as long as possible. And that would end up leading to economic losses, financial losses for the company, to the point when we've forced factories to permanently shut down because they couldn't maintain the level of disruption being caused by people taking direct action. But also, it meant that they were severely interrupted in making these weapons or parts for weapons to massacre people in Palestine. A key thing about Alba Systems as well is that they market their weapons as tested on Palestinians. So in our head, it wasn't about saying to the government, okay, stop certain export licenses to Israel, where whilst we do, advocate for that, the very existence of these factories meant that the destruction of Palestine would continue because that whole business model was based on the destruction and colonization of Palestine in order to make and develop these weapons and surveillance technology upon them and then sell them to other governments across the world. So it was about going, we are going to shut down this factory, and the only people we can rely on to do that is ourselves.
And it should, of course, be remembered, which you just mentioned, that Palestine Action was incredibly successful. I mean, it managed to shut down the Elbit Systems factories in Oldham and Tamworth. It shut down Elbit's London and Bristol headquarters. In fact, that the latter one was just very recently, and it was obviously responsible for causing Elbit to lose numerous contracts and sustaining the significant financial losses that you were just talking about. So it was very clearly materially effective in damaging Elbit systems and thereby, helping to inhibit the Zionist war machine. I just want to follow up a little bit because you've talked elsewhere about protests being a controlled form of dissent, and you've said that they're essentially state-sanctioned protests organized in collaboration with the police. Why do these NGO-style groups I don't need to start naming names because there are many of them, but they're obviously very prominent in the sort of Palestine solidarity movement, let's say. Um, why do they refuse to endorse direct action?
I think there's probably multiple answers, but I think the most basic concept is that they are very comfortable staying within the acceptable realm of dissent. And staying within the acceptable realm of dissent, staying within the boundaries that the state allows for you to stay within, means that you will not be effective in creating change, because the state is not going to allow you to do something which is going to force them to change their policies towards dealing with the Zionist regime or the situation in Palestine. So if the state is sanctioning you to do a march, you walk from A to B, they give you the route. You are making it as easy as possible for them to manage and control the opposition to their policies and to their stance on Zionism. And it's quite a simple fact. I think when it comes to these organizations not supporting direct action, I believe that they see it as some sort of challenge to them, both in terms of maybe how much support they would get. I think, unfortunately, there is, as there is in every element of society, but there is an element of uh, wanting to control and dominate the movement in an acceptable manner, or manner that they deem as acceptable. And I think Palestine Action, direct action, is a challenge to them, both morally, in terms of how far they are willing to push their advocacy for the Palestinian people. But it was also a challenge directly in terms of questioning the efficacy of solely relying on marches. I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand the power of having a mass of people show up for Palestine regularly and to show the strength of the movement. But the issue is when you say that is the limit, we will never succeed. And we saw this when it came to the Iraq war. I think up to 1 million people were on the streets protesting against that. It didn't create the change needed. These things are manageable by the state. We have to be unmanageable, uncontrollable, and an effective opposition. And I think Palestine Action was an effective opposition. And that is why they have gone so far in terms of cracking down on civil liberties, on Palestine Action and the movement, um, in order to do what they could to stop it. And in that process, they have exposed themselves, their complicity even further, and lodged, something, even out of that, which has also created a lot of opposition to their policies on terrorism, counterterrorism.
Well, let's actually now turn then to the fallout from the prescription of Palestine Action. So, since Palestine Action was designated as a supposed terrorist organization by the British government, the rate of arrests under the Terrorism Act 2000 has increased by 3,100%. We've seen over 1,500 people, many of them elderly and disabled, arrested for allegedly holding placards saying that they oppose genocide and that they support Palestine Action. Many of those people have actually now been charged as well. I mean, this is a watershed moment in British political history, and it shows how meaningless the idea of terrorism has become, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think they've shot themselves in the foot big time. I don't think they expected such a strong reaction. I think they underestimated people within the movement, groups within the movement, and the solidarity that does exist amongst the movement, and also the support Palestine Action had. They massively underestimated that when they decided to prescribe. But what they have done is completely demean the power of the terrorism, counterterrorism regime to the point where it's become a farce. People do not take it seriously. And it also makes people question the whole system, the whole regime that they are using in terms of counterterrorism policies. You know, we had people in Palestine Action raided at gunpoint by counterterrorism police, months before the prescription came into force, held for days on end without charge, or subject to psychological warfare, interrogated repeatedly using these counterterrorism powers. So I think they have completely demeaned their own terrorism regime. I think that's really, really clear. And and what does that say? If the state truly believes that the counterterrorism system is supposed to be there to protect the British public, and you are now prescribing Palestine Action, which has completely delegitimized that whole system, and also all of your resources. I mean, it's ridiculous. If we just look at, over 2,000 arrests in 3 months, the whole of last year, there were 248 arrests under the Terrorism Act. So where is all these resources being spent on people holding placards, people holding up magazines, people wearing T-shirts, just in the service of what? To protect the Israeli weapons industry, to protect their relationship with Israel. They are willing to crack down on their own citizens, arrest them under an extremely totalitarian and authoritarian act in order to please who? This is being done for the Israeli weapons industry. That's why we were prescribed. That's why old people, vicars, ordinary people from all walks of life, are being arrested is to protect Zionism. And they have further exposed how deeply entrenched they are in the Zionist regime by not just prescribing Palestine Action, but then going after everyone who wants to stand up against that prescription. And I have to say, they didn't foresee this. Because I'm in the judicial review, I get to see a lot of the documents. They completely overlooked the support that Palestine Action had from the grassroots, not necessarily the mainstream organizations, not necessarily mainstream media, but the grassroots where we had been operating for years across the country, doing these types of actions with the support of local people. And a lot of those people who are getting arrested are people who who have watched Palestine Action for years, didn't get involved in the actions, maybe didn't feel like they were able to, but would be donating to Palestine Action. They'd be giving, their 20 quid a month or however much to support the activities of Palestine Action. And now they have been pushed to a certain extent to the point where they're going, no, I'm not going to allow this to happen, where they're called terrorists. And I'm now going to step up and support that. So I think the years of direct action, the seeing people putting their liberty on the line, seeing the prisoners, there's currently 29 prisoners in prison for taking action on Palestine Action, and the sacrifice that went into that by many, many, many people in Palestine Action has led to a moment where an even bigger people who were watching and supporting for all that time are so outraged that they're stepping up. So, I think it's quite spectacular to see how much this has backfired on the government. And I think that, while we take the legal case, it's really crucial for people to show their opposition to the prescription. And I think it's a real challenge for the state. And one of the main reasons being because it has just delegitimized um, their own laws, and it showed how authoritarian they really are.
Well, I have to say, I've also been very pleasantly surprised by certain individuals who I've known for many years. I won't name them, but I've known them for many years, and I don't think they'll mind me saying that, they're not, they wouldn't even consider themselves to be some great political radicals. Quite the contrary, but they've been absolutely disgusted by the prescription of Palestine Action. And they are some of the people who have been alleged to have been holding those placards. So, I mean, the breadth of support is absolutely massive. I mean, I just wanted to ask you about, just relatedly, the excuse that these British government ministers keep making about the prescription of Palestine Action, because you may have seen some of them when they've been challenged. They just say, well, there was this intelligence that they had, which meant that Palestine Action was such a massive threat that it had to be prescribed immediately. I mean, it seems clear to most people that this intelligence excuse is just a load of nonsense. And what's your position on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It is. We know why we're prescribed, or the basis that they have prescribed Palestine Action is because of property damage for a political cause. It's been in there since the start of the Terrorism Act about, if you cause serious property damage for a political cause, it just hasn't been used to prescribe a group like Palestine Action because the vast majority of people do not see that as terrorism. And so we know that that's why we're prescribed. That's the basis of the prescription. It's really clear from the papers. And I think this idea of using this secret intelligence or um, I mean, we've seen it before. We saw it before with the Iraq war. It's just this wink and trust me, I know what we're saying. And I don't think it's got them very far by using these dirty tricks to try and justify the prescription. I mean, they also had the Iranian funding one, right? And that's just disappeared. That's not in the case. They even said to Private Eye, "Oh, we don't recognize that claim." But just days before the vote was going through, it was all over the Times. Are they getting Iranian funding? And all these questions, all this foreign influence, and then it just disappeared once the vote passed because it was complete. It was just complete lies that they were trying to use these types of tactics to manufacture consent, and it's racist, right? You're not going to say an environmental group, oh, you got funding from, I don't know, Switzerland or Russia. You're not going to suggest that. But because it's about Palestine, you then try and make these links in people's heads where you've already been, pumping this kind of racist rhetoric about uh, foreign influence and etc. in people's heads for so long. So, oh, it's Palestine, it must have a foreign influence. And I think they're just deeply embarrassed by the fact. Look, I am Palestinian, I am Iraqi, I was also born and raised in Britain. I think they're just deeply embarrassed by the fact that this is a domestic issue and that they're prescribing a domestic direct action group for tackling Britain's role with the colonization of Palestine and their ongoing role with Zionism and these weapons factories that are on their doorstep. So they resort to these tactics to try and smear us. And I bet Cooper was relentless, And they also said that that there's future planning that they had to just stop, right? Well, it's really interesting because we know they had decided to prescribe us in March. So we met the criteria in March 2025. They didn't prescribe us until right after the action at the RAF base. And that was 4 months time frame. So if your reason for prescribing us was to stop some imminent, the way they make it sound is very ominous and scary. That's the intention. Why did you wait 4 months to prescribe us if there was something imminent going to happen? Now I've seen the documents. It's complete. It's complete. It's just fabrication, and they're just trying to use buzzwords to sound like, oh look, we stopped something huge from happening. Um, what did they stop? What, people shutting down weapons factories? Is that what you're protecting the general public from? It has no effect on the general public. It only has an effect on the weapons industry. That's what Palestine Action has been doing for years. So I think they just have to, if they said the truth about why they were doing this and what Palestine Action was actually about, then they would have no legitimacy. So they have to resort to smear tactics and to lies, basically, in order to justify it. But I'm also really impressed by how little that has affected people's view. I think people are not easily fooled. They are regularly insulting the intelligence of normal people. I think 2 years of genocide has also made people very critical of what the government has to say around these topics. Um, and we've seen this before. So yeah, I mean they have tried to say a lot of things and to adapt the story of why we are prescribed based on the amount of support that was growing. And what they would do, Yvette Cooper especially, whenever there was one of these defend our juries, lift the ban actions going to happen on a Saturday, it would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. There would be another minister saying another, fabrication or smear about Palestine Action, and they would have a planned campaign for the week before to try and knock down those numbers, to try and deter people from standing up against this prescription.
Of course, just for our viewers who may not necessarily be aware, particularly internationally, those defend our jury actions have been sort of people en masse gathering in public, holding placards, or alleged to have been holding placards saying, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action," and of course they've been arrested in a sort of act of mass civil disobedience. But I think you're absolutely right that um, this isn't cutting through with most people. And it's clear that there's been a lot of discontent, even among the British establishment, about the prescription of Palestine action, because obviously we were talking before about the huge grassroots support, but also you have even the pro-Israel Telegraph newspaper publishing numerous articles against prescription, and you have commentators ranging from Tories like Andrew Neil to liberals like James O'Brien saying that it shouldn't have been prescribed. And then very recently, the investigative journalist Matt Kennard revealed that a source close to the senior leadership of Britain's foreign intelligence agency, MI6, has said that there's significant opposition within MI6 to the prescription. Have you been surprised by the breadth of opposition towards the prescription of Palestine action?
Yes, I think the true answer is yes. I have been surprised. Before prescription, as I mentioned before, Palestine Action's campaign wasn't targeted at getting in the media or in the mainstream media. It was about shutting down these weapons factories. And we also understood that that doesn't often interest the mainstream media, our regular actions at Albert Systems. And so we did have a brilliant base of support in the community surrounding these factories and in the Palestine movement, amongst the grassroots of the Palestine movement. We didn't have much mainstream support from the major organizations, and yeah, that was just the reality. So when the prescriptions started coming through, and to see the backlash was incredible. And you can, as a movement, it is a it's a very unique thing to go through, to say that the group you're involved in is going to be prescribed as a terrorist organization. And but at the same time, seeing how many people were coming out against it from across the political spectrum, it was clear that this was a mistake by the state, that they made a huge political mistake in doing this, and it is having a backlash. And I think
Well, just
sometimes
sorry to interrupt, but when we're talking about the state, of course, at the same time, you seem to have these different parts of the state warring against each other. So you have Britain's sort of premier foreign intelligence agency saying effectively that, briefing out that we don't like this, we're very much opposed to this. And then, of course, you have other sort of discontent being voiced among establishment voices. So this is an element surely that has to be exploited. I mean, the fact that the British state is actually not really unified on this.
No, that's definitely true. I probably should say Yvette Cooper, actually. And I think it's interesting that she's no longer Home Secretary quite soon afterwards. I know she's now Foreign Secretary, but it's still very interesting that she's not sticking this through, and it's been passed on to Shabana Mahmood to deal with it. Who we can we can go on to that. But yeah, I mean, I think with MI6, I couldn't imagine. If you told me a year ago we'd be in this position and MI6 would be saying, no, that's too far. But if you think about it logically, it does make a lot of sense that they wouldn't be pleased with this because in their eyes there are certain units that are supposed to deal with activism, right? You have the mainstream police forces, the public order units. Now when you make a group like Palestine Action, a terrorist organization, that will take away resources from other counterterrorism resources, from their resources. And so suddenly they are seeing their resources being used on protesters, on people taking direct action, rather than international groups that are prescribed in Britain. And I think as well for them, the undermining of the public confidence in intelligence agencies, in the terrorism regime, it's really all unraveling now, where people are questioning the Terrorism Act, questioning the parts in it that criminalize free speech and holding placards and making speeches, things that actually we've experienced in the Palestine movement um, for quite a while. But this has now become a mainstream issue, and people are questioning what these agencies are doing. They're questioning the reasons for the Terrorism Act and how it's being used and weaponized against the general public, because that's what's happening in this situation. And there has been dissent against this. Don't think this is a unified position. I also don't think Yvette Cooper was certain on doing this either, because she waited. She was given the decision that this prescription review group, right? They met in March and they said, yeah, they cause serious damage, so they can be prescribed as a terrorist organization, basically. She waited for 4 months. And in that time, some of the reasons they used for delaying the prescription was that the ceasefire broke in Gaza, that it was Ramadan for Muslims, uh, that there were criminal trials it could interfere with. They were worried about losing local elections. So they use all of these political reasons to delay prescribing Palestine Action. So how can they don't even believe that this is an imminent threat to delay it for political reasonings. It's a political tool used to crush dissent, and they tried to find the most opportune timing, which is probably why they did it after the RAF action, but that hugely backfires on them. And there is dissent amongst people within the state. I think it's a huge problem for them. And to be honest, I think the best thing they could do is just overturn the prescription as soon as possible, or at the very least, not fight the judicial review, because that's probably going to be their way out of this mess. But I do truly believe that however this is resolved, that Palestine Action will be deprescribed at some point, and there will be consequences for those who launch this attack on all of us, for locking up people, for holding up signs, for arresting people at gunpoint, for taking direct action. There will be consequences, and I think Shabana Mahmood, putting her political career on this is a stupid mistake.
Well, I mean, just to turn to that, obviously, we're talking here about the British Home Secretary. So, of course, that was Yvette Cooper while the prescription was happening. And it seemed that when Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, had this mini reshuffle of his government, that this was going to be a way to potentially try to get out of this mess, that by appointing Shabana Mahmood, someone who had previously expressed sort of pro-Palestine sentiment, is from the Muslim community apparently, that maybe this would be an opportunity for the government with a fresh face to take a different tack. But actually, the British government with Shabana Mahmood has been doubling down despite the huge backlash that they have faced. And of course, in the wake of the Manchester synagogue attack earlier in October, in which one Jewish person was killed by an attacker and another was killed by the police, the Home Secretary said that repeated protests about the same issue will be restricted under new laws. And she said that the right to protest must not be used to intimidate or spread fear amongst communities. What does this say about the Zionist regime's influence and the degree of state capture in Britain now?
I think Shabana Mahmood is very interesting to see her rise. We've seen the videos of her in 2014 during an assault on Gaza when she's going out making these speeches, speaking very passionately about Palestine. And I think looking at her rise to power, it really does show just how much power corrupts people and actually how much you have to compromise in order to get to that position. So somebody who was at least seemingly pro-Palestine, I do believe she probably believed in what she was saying back then, has to compromise all of her beliefs on Palestine and actually turn on the Palestine movement in order to maintain her position of power in the British government. I mean, I think that is a very microcosm of showing how Zionism has captured the British government when you have to make such a U-turn to betray the people that you used to protest amongst and implement more measures upon people to restrict their right to protest on Palestine against the genocide. I mean, I don't understand why these people want to get into position in the first place. When if you actually genuinely believe that you want to create change, I think by the time they get to the top, they have stripped themselves of all of their morality, all of their humanity. The only thing that matters to them is keeping in power, and to do that in Britain, you have to align yourselves with Zionist policies, and to keep the status quo going. And so I think, yeah, it's very clear what's happening. And Yvette Cooper, the previous Home Secretary, was the one who made the decision. That was after extensive lobbying since the start of Palestine Action from the Israeli government, from Elbit Systems, a foreign weapons manufacturer, from pro-Israel lobby groups, from lords who were paid by weapons manufacturers. So there was a significant amount of foreign influence and lobbying from weapons companies that went into this prescription. So they were willing to prescribe and launch this huge attack on British citizens in order to protect the interests of a foreign genocidal regime and its weapons manufacturers. And I think that shows how far they are willing to go, that they are willing to lock up their own citizens to protect the ideology and protect Zionism and what it's led to today, which is a genocide in Gaza. And Shabana Mahmood has just picked up that legacy. And, I do find it quite interesting that, I think one of the first posts she did when she became Home Secretary was she was in the police control room with Mark Rowley, the head of Met Police, while over 800 people were being arrested for holding up placards. And she was watching it from this control room and taking pictures and doing a photo op and posted that supporting Palestine isn't the same as supporting a prescribed organization, whatever line she was fed to say. And now she has done this, trying to implement new laws to restrict the right to protest even further in Britain. And I did think if she was smart, that she wouldn't go down with this ban, and that the smartest thing she could do is just to ignore it, see what happens, because then when it's lifted or overturned or whatever happens with it, it won't be on her legacy, it'll be on Yvette Cooper's. I thought that's probably what she'll do, but she has tied herself into the situation where she is now part of enforcing Yvette Cooper's ban. And she is in a very Muslim, a majority Muslim constituency. And what do these people think is going to happen when you betray Palestine, when you betray your own citizens, and when they can see what's going on? She's probably going to lose her seat in the next election. I hope she does. Um, it's very disturbing to see, but I think the one thing we have all gained from this is clarity on how complicit, how involved they are, um, and how much Zionism has captured British institutions and the British government. At least we have gained the clarity, and in many cases, the courage to resist that.
Well, it's very clear that the real foreign influence in Britain is not coming from Iran supposedly funding Palestine Action, which is a load of nonsense. It's actually the demonstrable influence of the Zionist regime through its lobby groups and indeed the Zionist movement here in Britain. I just want to turn now to the situation in Gaza. So, a ceasefire has recently been approved, but that obviously isn't the end of the story. And we know as well that the story didn't start on October the 7th. Of course, when you co founded Palestine Action in mid 2020, that was over 3 years before October the 7th. I mean, this is an issue on which you, I, so many other people have been campaigning for years. And that's because Zionism has always been a racist colonial ideology that seeks to eradicate all of Palestine and expand even beyond those borders to create a greater Israel. So a ceasefire in Gaza is not the end of Zionism, and it's not even the end of suffering in Gaza. Is there a danger that with this ceasefire, some people will lose sight of what's at stake? And what's your advice to people who may be slightly overexcited about what this ceasefire means?
Yeah, I think that the genocide in Gaza has reached so many people across the world that people are forced to notice. And a lot of those people weren't paying attention before October 7th. And that's very, I remember when after October 7th, just how many people were wanting to take direct action who hadn't necessarily been involved before. And that was quite new for people who have been involved for years and years to see people willing to risk their liberty for something where it was they recently learned about it through the genocide that was happening in Gaza. Like you said, Palestine Action had existed in 2020, and the reason it existed because there was the occupation of Gaza, of the West Bank, occupation of historic Palestine, the continued colonization, the continued besiegement of Gaza, and the goal, and the existence of these weapons factories. And I think just going back to the Elbit weapons factories, the only reason they exist is because of the destruction of Palestine. So if this ceasefire meant that the testing of weapons, the testing of surveillance technology would cease to exist, that system of oppression, of military subjugation of the Palestinian people would cease to exist, Elbit wouldn't exist. So when you can see the symptoms and the outcomes of the Zionist regime and oppression of Palestinians existing in your towns and cities, so long as they exist, there is also the continued colonization of Palestine. That's why Palestine Action was very adamant we had to shut down these factories. They existed to destroy Palestine. So by Just by shutting them down, we are acting towards the struggle for Palestinian liberation, and we have got to, in whichever way we can, maintain and grow this struggle against the Zionist regime, against the oppression of Palestinians. And let's be honest, the situation in Gaza is very, very fragile and uncertain. I sense that it will still be highly militarized in a lot of ways. And we have a responsibility to see this through until a free Palestine. We have made massive steps forward in terms of the international boycott movement, in terms of people turning on the Zionist regime. And I hope this ceasefire holds. I hope that people in Palestine and Gaza get the relief that they so desperately need. Um, but we need to use all of that strength we have gained as a movement to just keep going, keep applying the pressure, keep shutting down these places until Palestine is free. And I just can't emphasize that enough, that our solidarity is not contingent on, at that very moment, Palestinians going through the worst reality imaginable. We do not only stand up for them when they are literally going through the most extreme form of a genocide, because when that stops, it doesn't suddenly become a liberation. We have to fight for liberation. We have to fight to get to that point. What we've done now is just pause the worst face of the Zionist regime in this moment. But a slow genocide and the continued occupation, the continued militarization of Palestine, the continued settlement building, etc., is killing Palestinians every single day. The violence continues, and we just have to keep fighting until Palestine is liberated. And I do believe that we can get there within our lifetime. I think a lot of things have changed now, and the movement's been bigger than ever. And I think we just have to keep going.
Well, one thing, I mean, obviously with the ceasefire is uh, there's an increased focus on what the sort of immediate to medium term um, situation will be like in Gaza in terms of governance. And we've heard, even before the ceasefire, certain plans being touted. You're both Palestinian and Iraqi. So when it comes to the idea of Tony Blair, the butcher of Iraq, potentially being made a sort of colonial viceroy of Gaza, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it makes me absolutely sick. This man was responsible for the murder of up to 1 million Iraqis, and to see that he is still given some sort of he still has this reputation and is very high up in the establishment when he should be locked up. Let's be clear about that. He's a mass murderer. He deserves absolutely no respect. I can't even believe that this is a conversation, right? So there was no accountability for what the US and what Tony Blair did in Iraq. And instead, we are now, asking them and allowing them to govern other parts of the Middle East, to govern Gaza, and to see, the man who was responsible for the destruction of my mother's homeland rule over my father's homeland is a very, very disturbing concept. I hope it doesn't come to that. I really hope it doesn't come to that, because it's a reality that I can't even really imagine what that would look like. I think it's very difficult to picture how that would be and how brutal it would be, if we're completely honest. He has no regard for the Iraqi people. He has no regard for the Palestinian people. This man does not care about the ordinary lives of the indigenous people of these countries. He does not. He is showing that. And it will just lead to continuation of the genocide, if we're honest about this.
And it's obviously a massive demonstration of the ongoing colonial arrogance of Western powers that they could even consider putting I mean, that they would even consider imposing anyone from the West to govern Palestine. I mean, they've obviously, with the Palestinian Authority, had the pretense for many years of saying, well, we've got this sort of sham organization run by Palestinian collaborators to, run the West Bank, and we want to bring them in to run Gaza. But now it's like full mask off. We don't even want to try to use our own Palestinian collaborators. We're just going to impose our own people. And the person we've chosen for that task is Tony Blair, of all people. So I mean, it's absolutely absurd and something that has to be fought back against, and something that shouldn't obviously be treated as being sort of fait accompli. Something that's definitely going to happen. It should be pushed back against. I just want to turn back to the situation with Palestine Action, because obviously you're continuing to legally challenge the prescription, and you've been granted permission for a judicial review, and that hearing will be taking place, as I understand it, in late November this year. Can you give us a brief overview of the legal arguments that you're making in that judicial review?
Yeah, so we've been granted the judicial review on two grounds. One being that the prescription is disproportionate to freedom of speech and the right to protest, which I think has been very evident by not just the arrest of people holding signs saying they support Palestine Action, but also the arrest of people for holding up private eye jokes or the Palestine Action T-shirts. And actually, we've seen academics now being disciplined for signing a letter saying they oppose the prescription of Palestine Action just for opposing a law. That this has had a very far reaching consequences for freedom of speech. And that is just on the people who've been directly affected. Actually, the chilling effect of that is probably in the hundreds of thousands in terms of people who want to say certain things, but are unable to say it because they are scared of the repercussions. And I think that is a huge problem now because of the prescription. And the second ground is that the government, Yvette Cooper, failed to consult Palestine Action on the prescription. And that's actually quite important because what she did do was she consulted the Israeli lobby, she consulted the Israeli government, she consulted these weapons manufacturers, these lords, pro-Israel lobby groups, including, We Believe in Israel, campaign against anti-Semitism. They were very involved in this process. But what she did not do was consult Palestine Action or any human rights organizations on before she decided to prescribe Palestine Action. So it's very clear that she had failed in that duty when she made this decision. And so that will go ahead on the 25th to 27th of November, and hopefully we would get a result 2 weeks after that. The government is trying to appeal the decision, which allowed us to go for a judicial review, which is very interesting when they won't even, you know, they are appealing before you even get the chance to actually argue the case fully in court to try and protect themselves from legal scrutiny. But that has already been heard. We're waiting for a result on that. Inshallah, that goes well. So we should be on track for the judicial review to go ahead at the end of November.
And how can people support the judicial review, either financially or in other ways?
So actually, we have had so much support before the prescription. I don't know if you saw, but we raised like £100,000 in 24 hours for these fees. So we are thankfully covered in terms of the legal fees, just because of how many people so quickly, in a week before prescription, donated to help the legal challenge. So thank you to everyone for that. To support people can come down to the actual judicial review. It is complicated legally to say exactly what you can and can't say. I'm not, I don't think anyone knows that truly because of the amount of different arrests that have taken place. But we also know that defender juries are escalating their campaign. in November ahead of the judicial review, and I believe during the actual judicial review is taking place. So you can also support them in that campaign. Um, and also just sharing and supporting online in any way you can, raising awareness of what's going on. Get down there if you can, and obviously just be aware of whatever risks you take by whatever you say outside of the courtroom. But I think as well in the build up to it, it's just maintaining the pressure, it's maintaining the momentum. We've seen so many different types of groups come out with statements coming out in the media against this prescription, and just keeping that up.
Lastly, I just wanted to ask you about all of these different direct action groups popping up in Britain and across the world who are continuing to go after the Zionist war machine. I'm not going to name them, but there are lots of examples that we could talk about. It shows that they can prescribe Palestine action, but the genie is out of the bottle now, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. What Palestine Action did was direct action against the Israeli weapons factories. We had a strategy and we used tactics that have been used for decades, if not way longer than that, in terms of direct action. It cannot, they can prescribe Palestine Action, they cannot stop direct action happening against these weapons manufacturers.
And of course, we need to continue to push for the de-prescription of Palestine action, which is vital not just to protect the people who have been arrested and who are being charged, but also to ensure that we draw a line in the sand and we say to the British state that they're not going to get away with this, and also to the Zionist regime itself that your overreach and infiltration of our government is not going to have the effects that you think it will, and we will continue to fight you and we will win. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Huda, I really appreciate you doing me the honor of appearing on Attrition. And I have to say that to me and countless others, you are a living legend and an inspiration. And I thank you for everything that you've done and continue to do for the cause of Palestinian liberation. So thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much, and for everything you're doing.
Well, what I'm doing is very minor in comparison, but thank you very much again, Huda. And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. Help us to overcome the algorithmic suppression that we're facing. And we'll see you on the next one.